Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the bank holding all your money has simply vanished. Your life savings gone overnight. Now imagine that happening to millions of people at once, across an entire nation. Factories shutting down. A quarter of all workers jobless. Families lining up for a single piece of bread. This was the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe in modern history. And today we're going to explain exactly how the world went broke from the very beginning. To understand the fall, you first have to understand the dizzying height it fell from. The 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties, were a decade of explosive prosperity in America. The First World War was over. New inventions were everywhere. Cars, radios, telephones, electric appliances. Factories hummed. Cities glittered with new wealth. People believed a new age of permanent abundance had arrived. Optimism wasn't just high. It felt like a law of nature. At the center of this boom was the stock market, and something fundamental had changed. For the first time, ordinary Americans, not just the wealthy elite, were pouring their money into stocks. Teachers, barbers, factory workers, all chasing the dream of getting rich. The market kept climbing year after year, and it seemed like it would never stop. Buying stocks looked less like a gamble and more like a guaranteed path to wealth. Everyone wanted in. But here's the dangerous part. The mechanism that turned a boom into a bomb. People weren't just buying stocks with their own money. They were buying on margin. This meant you could buy $100 of stock while only putting down $10 of your own. The other $90 was borrowed from your broker. As long as prices rose, you made huge profits on money that wasn't even yours. It felt like magic. Let's make sure that idea is crystal clear, because it is the key to everything. Buying on margin is using borrowed money to invest. It massively amplifies your gains when prices go up. But it works in reverse too. If the stock falls, you don't just lose your small deposit. You still owe the entire loan. Margin turns a modest drop into total ruin. Millions of Americans had built their fortunes on this fragile foundation of debt. By 1929, the stock market had become pure mania. Prices had detached completely from reality. Companies were valued at insane levels that their actual profits could never justify. People quit their jobs to trade stocks full-time. Shoeshine boys and elevator operators were giving stock tips. When the people with the least financial knowledge are euphorically certain they can't lose, that is the classic signal of a bubble at its peak. And this one was about to burst. A few clear-eyed observers warned that the prices made no sense, that a crash was inevitable. But they were mocked and ignored. In a mania, optimism feels like wisdom, and caution feels like cowardice. Nobody wants to be the person who left the party early while everyone else got rich. So the warnings were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. The market climbed to a final, towering peak in September 1929. Then the ground began to shift. But before we reach the crash, you need to see the cracks hidden beneath the shiny surface, because the boom was far more fragile than it looked. America had actually seen a warning just a few years earlier. In the mid-1920s, Florida experienced a wild real estate bubble. People bought swampland sight unseen, convinced prices would rise forever. Then it collapsed, ruining thousands. It was a small preview of the mania to come, and almost nobody learned from it. There was a deeper rot, too, staggering inequality. The wealth of the Roaring Twenties was real, but it flowed overwhelmingly to the top. A small slice of Americans grew fabulously rich, while a huge share of families lived close to poverty, barely able to afford the very products the factories were churning out. An economy where most people can't actually afford to buy things is standing on a very thin foundation, no matter how tall the skyscrapers grow. This created a hidden trap called overproduction. America's factories had become incredibly efficient, producing more cars, radios, and goods than ever before. But if ordinary workers couldn't afford to buy all of it, what kept the boom going? The answer was debt. Companies propped up sales by letting people buy now and pay later on installment credit. So beneath the prosperity, both consumers and investors were drowning in borrowed money. The whole boom was running on loans. So picture the true state of things by 1929. A stock market inflated by borrowed money. Consumers propped up by borrowed money. Wealth piled at the very top while the foundation grew shaky. Factories making more than people could afford. It was a magnificent tower built on a thin layer of debt and blind optimism. It only needed one strong push to bring the whole thing down. And in October, that push finally came. In late October 1929, the panic began. On October 24th, a day later called Black Thursday, prices suddenly plunged as a wave of fear swept the trading floor. Investors who had bought on margin were terrified. To calm things, powerful bankers stepped in and bought stocks publicly, briefly steadying the market. For a moment, it seemed the worst had passed. It had not. The real catastrophe was just days away. Then came the day that defined an era. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. The market completely collapsed. Everyone was trying to sell at once, and there were almost no buyers. Prices fell off a cliff. Billions of dollars in wealth evaporated in a matter of hours. The margin investors were wiped out instantly, owing money they could never repay. The dream of the Roaring Twenties died that day. The great crash had arrived, and the world would never be the same. Now, here's a crucial point that confuses many people. The stock market crash did not, by itself, cause the Great Depression. The crash was the trigger, the first domino. The real catastrophe came from what happened next, as the shock spread from Wall Street into the everyday economy of banks, jobs, and ordinary families. To understand the true disaster, we have to follow the money as it drained out of the entire system. The damage hit the banks first, and this is where it became truly devastating. Banks had also been gambling with their depositors' money in the stock market, and now those investments were worthless. Worse, banks had lent enormous sums to margin investors who could no longer pay them back. Suddenly, banks across the country were insolvent. They had promised to keep people's money safe, but that money was simply gone, and the public was about to find out. This sparked one of the most terrifying phenomena in all of finance, the bank run. When people feared their bank might collapse, they rushed to withdraw all their cash at once. But here's the brutal truth about banking. A bank never has everyone's money sitting in a vault. It lends most of it out. So when everyone demands their money simultaneously, the bank physically cannot pay. Even healthy banks could be destroyed by panic alone. And panic is contagious. As word spread that one bank had failed, depositors at other banks panicked too, triggering more runs, causing more failures, in a terrifying chain reaction. Thousands of banks across America collapsed. Each failure wiped out the savings of everyone who banked there, with no insurance, no protection, no recovery. Ordinary families who had done nothing wrong watched their entire life savings disappear forever. Fear itself had become a weapon of mass destruction. As banks collapsed, the money supply itself began to shrink violently. With banks failing and the survivors too terrified to lend, the flow of credit, the lifeblood of any economy, simply dried up. Businesses couldn't get loans to operate. People couldn't borrow to buy. Money, in a real sense, was vanishing from the economy. And as money disappeared, prices fell, spending stopped, and the entire economic machine began grinding to a horrifying halt. Here's where many historians point a finger at an institution that was supposed to help: the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. As the crisis raged, the Fed failed to act boldly. Instead of flooding the system with money to stop the banks from collapsing, it largely stood by and, at times, even tightened the money supply, making everything worse. A mistake at the very top turned a severe recession into a decade-long catastrophe. The lesson would never be forgotten. Part of why the Fed felt trapped was an old rule called the gold standard. Back then, every dollar had to be backed by real gold held in reserve. This meant the government couldn't simply create more money to rescue the economy because it didn't have unlimited gold. Nations clung to this system out of tradition and fear, and it acted like a straitjacket, preventing the very flood of money that could have stopped the collapse. This triggered the most insidious force of all: deflation, falling prices. It sounds nice at first, cheaper goods, but the death spiral. As prices fell, businesses earned less and cut wages or fired workers. People, expecting prices to fall even further, stopped spending and waited. That collapse in spending pushed prices down again, causing more cuts, more layoffs, more fear. Money became more valuable just sitting still, so the entire economy froze in place, paralyzed. Now the disaster spilled into the streets, into the lives of everyday people. As businesses lost customers and credit, They slashed production and laid off workers by the millions. Those unemployed workers couldn't spend, so other businesses lost their customers too and laid off even more workers. It was a vicious downward spiral. At its worst, around 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. 25%, an almost unimaginable level of human suffering. The human reality behind that statistic was heartbreaking. Families lost their homes when they couldn't pay the rent or mortgage. Shanty towns of makeshift shacks sprang up on the edges of cities, built from scrap wood and cardboard. People bitterly nicknamed them Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, whom many blame for the crisis. Long lines of hungry people, called breadlines, stretched around city blocks, waiting for a bowl of soup or a piece of bread. And then, as if the economic collapse wasn't enough, nature delivered a second blow. Across the Great Plains, years of drought and poor farming practices turned the soil to dust. Massive dust storms, some thousands of feet high, rolled across the land, burying farms and choking the life out of the region. It became known as the Dust Bowl. Hundreds of thousands of desperate farming families abandoned everything and migrated west, searching for any work they could find. It's also critical to understand that this was not just an American tragedy. It was a global one. The economies of the world were deeply connected, and as America collapsed, it dragged its trading partners down with it. Germany, Britain, and nations around the globe plunged into their own depressions. Unemployment and despair spread across continents. The economic ruin and desperation of these years would even help fuel the rise of dangerous, extremist movements that led toward another world war. And the world made the catastrophe even worse with a disastrous decision about trade. In an attempt to protect American jobs, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, slapping huge taxes on imported goods. It backfired horribly. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs. Global trade collapsed by more than half. By trying to wall themselves off, nations choked the very commerce that could have helped them recover. Fear had turned neighbors into economic enemies. Through the worst of it, the man in charge was President Herbert Hoover. Hoover believed deeply in rugged individualism, the idea that people should solve their own problems and that direct government handouts would weaken the nation's character. He thought the economy would naturally correct itself if everyone just stayed patient and confident. So as millions starved, his government's response was cautious, slow, and far too small for the scale of the catastrophe. Hoover famously kept insisting that prosperity was just around the corner. But for the suffering public, those words felt like a cruel joke. Their savings were gone, their jobs had vanished, and the leader of the nation seemed to be telling them to simply wait it out. The shanty towns of the homeless were bitterly named Hoovervilles in his honor. An empty pocket turned inside out was called a Hoover flag. His name became a symbol of the despair itself. To be fair, Hoover did eventually take some action, funding a few public works and trying to prop up banks and businesses. But it was too little, too late, and much of his aid was aimed at institutions rather than directly at the starving people. His deep reluctance to have the federal government intervene boldly meant that every measure he took was a half step, when a moment demanded a giant leap. The suffering only deepened. The breaking point came in 1932 with the Bonus Army. Thousands of desperate World War I veterans, many jobless and hungry, marched on Washington to demand early payment of a bonus they had been promised. They camped in the Capitol with their families. In a shocking scene, the government sent in troops to forcibly drive these veterans out, burning their camp. The image of soldiers attacking starving veterans horrified the nation, and it sealed Hoover's fate. By 1932, America had hit rock bottom, and the people were desperate for change. In the presidential election, they overwhelmingly chose Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised bold, immediate action. When he took office in 1933, the banking system was in total collapse. Roosevelt understood that the deepest problem was fear itself, the panic that kept people pulling their money out and freezing the economy. His very first move would be aimed directly at breaking that cycle of terror. Roosevelt's first dramatic act was to declare a bank holiday. He ordered every bank in the country to close. Then, government inspectors examined them, and only the banks proven to be healthy were allowed to reopen. When they did, Roosevelt went on the radio and calmly explained to the nation that the reopened banks were now safe. Astonishingly, it worked. People began bringing their money back. The tide of panic finally began to turn. This was the beginning of a sweeping program of government action called the New Deal. It was a massive, unprecedented effort to rescue and reform the American economy. The government created jobs directly, hiring millions of people to build roads, bridges, dams, schools, and parks. It provided relief to the hungry and the homeless. For the first time, the federal government took direct, active responsibility for the economic well-being of its citizens. The New Deal also built permanent protections that still shape your life today. It created the FDIC, which ensures your bank deposits, so that a bank failure can never again wipe out your savings. It created the SEC to regulate the stock market and crack down on the reckless gambling and fraud that caused the crash. And it created Social Security, a safety net to protect the elderly and vulnerable from total destitution. These reforms were born directly from the pain of the Depression. But here is an uncomfortable truth. The New Deal helped. It eased the suffering and restored hope, but did not fully end the Depression. The economy improved, then stumbled again in the late 1930s. Unemployment remained painfully high for years. What finally pulled America completely out of the Great Depression was something nobody wanted: the outbreak of the Second World War, which forced massive government spending and put the entire nation back to work. When the United States entered the war in 1941, the transformation was staggering. Factories roared back to life, running around the clock to produce tanks, planes, ships, and weapons. Unemployment didn't just fall, it nearly vanished. The enormous government spending of the war effort finally provided the massive jolt of demand the economy had needed all along. It was a tragic irony. It took a global war to finally end the global depression. So with the full story told, the boom, the crash, the despair, and the recovery, let's pull out the timeless money lessons, because they protect you directly, even now. Lesson 1. Leverage is the great destroyer. The margin investors of the 1920s were annihilated because they had borrowed to invest. When you use debt to chase gains, you don't just risk your money, you risk far more than you have. Respect borrowed money. It is the accelerant in every financial fire. Lesson 2. Beware the mania, especially when everyone is certain. The surest sign of a dangerous bubble is universal, euphoric confidence, the belief that prices can only go up and that this time is different. When the least experienced people are convinced they cannot lose, the top is usually near. The crowd feels safest at the exact moment it is in the most danger. Learn to be cautious precisely when everyone else is greedy. Lesson 3. Panic and fear can destroy even healthy things. The bank runs proved that fear itself, when it spreads, can topple institutions that might otherwise have survived. In your own financial life, the lesson is profound. The investors who panic sell at the bottom of every crash lock in their losses forever. Keeping a cool head when everyone else is terrified is one of the rarest and most valuable financial skills you can ever develop. Lesson 4. Safety nets matter, and now you have them. The reason a bank failure can't wipe out your savings today is because the people who lived through the Depression built protections like deposit insurance to make sure it could never happen again. Understand and use these protections. Keep your money in insured accounts. The hard-won lessons of the 1930s are quietly shielding you every single day, whether you realize it or not. Lesson 5. Keep an emergency fund and don't rely on perfect times. The families devastated by the Depression had no cushion when the storm hit. The single most powerful thing you can do to protect yourself from any economic shock is to keep an emergency fund, several months of expenses in safe, accessible savings. It won't make you rich, but it can be the difference between weathering a crisis and being destroyed by it. Lesson 6. Diversification is your shield. So many people in 1929 had everything tied up in a soaring stock market with no backup. When it collapsed, they lost it all. Never let your entire financial life depend on a single asset, a single company, or a single bet. Spreading your money across different types of investments means that no single disaster can ever wipe you out completely. It is the closest thing to a free lunch in all of finance. The Great Depression also fundamentally changed how we think about the role of government in the economy. Before it, the prevailing belief was that the economy should be left entirely alone to fix itself. The Depression shattered that idea. It established the principle that in a severe crisis, the government and the central bank must act decisively to stop a collapse. That very principle is exactly why the response to the 2008 crisis looked so different and why it didn't spiral into a second Great Depression. And that connection to today is the most important part of this whole story. The reason we study the Great Depression so obsessively is so that we never repeat it. When the 2008 crisis hit, central bankers had read the history books. They knew the Fed's mistake of doing too little, so this time they flooded the system with money. They knew the danger of bank runs, so deposits were already insured. History had taught them how to fight the fire. But the deeper human patterns never truly disappear. Greed in the good times, reckless borrowing, the intoxicating belief that the boom will last forever. Then panic, fear, and collapse when reality returns. These forces are permanent features of human nature, and they guarantee that bubbles and crashes will keep happening in new forms, with new names, for as long as people chase easy money. The details change. The story always rhymes. So the next time markets are soaring and everyone insists the good times will never end, remember the shoeshine boys giving stock tips in 1929. Remember the margin investors who thought they'd found a magic money machine. Remember the breadlines that followed. Not to live in fear, but to stay grounded, to stay diversified, to keep your safety net, and to never bet more than you can afford to lose. That awareness is your protection. The Great Depression was the darkest economic chapter in modern history, a decade of fear, hunger, and shattered dreams. But it was also the source of some of the most important financial protections and lessons we have. It taught the world, at a terrible price, how fragile prosperity can be and how much wisdom, caution, and human resilience it takes to rebuild. Those lessons were paid for in suffering. The least we can do is remember them. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you. This is exactly the kind of deep money story we live for on this channel. We break down the biggest financial disasters, bubbles, frauds, and comebacks in all of history, and pull out the lessons that keep your own money safe. Subscribe to Money Stories, ring the bell, and tell me in the comments, do you think our modern economy has truly learned the lessons of the Great Depression? See you in the next one.